Okay, so let's go over here. You can see like what we have is we have this Docker file, right? This is where we left off with Docker, right? Is we start with Python, we make this app directory, we copy the requirements.txt file into our image, we run this requirements.txt, copy, I guess, the rest of the code. That's this env file. Yeah. And then, or I guess it's a whole directory. And then we run Flask run and, set, this is saying, right, that we're able to make requests to our Flask application from outside of the Docker container. All right. And then if you remember, like, I already built this image. If I look at like Docker image ls, right, I guess I have a bunch of images. The one, I think it's this, Flask Docker. Let me see, it's in the reading. Okay, it's called Flask Docker. Okay, so let's just boot this up normally. The only thing that's hard, so it'll be Docker run -p, right? We're mapping the ports. So this is the port on my host machine, right, on the computer, on the laptop. And this is mapping it to the port in the container. And then this is what I forget, is we have to set this environmental variable, right? Because remember, what happens is this is going to call Flask run. And then Flask run is going to look for the environmental variable that tells us what file to run. So here we're saying, hey, run project init.py. Okay. Yeah. I don't even know if we need this part right here, but I guess it still works. And then finally we put the image name, Flask Docker. Okay, so -e project --under init.py Flask Docker. You can see, okay, this is booted up. It's going to port 5000, and then we're mapping also to port 5000. So here, right, this is working. It says not found, but that's because the only route we have is to /users. So if we go to /users, right, there's our Bart Simpson. So this is review, right? This is, we have this image where we want to run it. So that's the container. To do that, we're mapping our ports, right? We're passing through an environmental variable, this Flask app thing, and we're running the actual image, or then we're specifying the image that we want to run. Another way we can do this is using Docker Compose. So I just have to remember the version number. Give me 1 second. All right, cool. So what we'll have to do is boot up or start, kind of do this Docker Compose .yaml, YML. Okay, so we just literally made, this is a YAML file, and we just call it Docker Compose. We'll do like Docker Compose up, whatever. See, it is reading this, but it's saying, hey, we better, we need some actual YAML inside of there. So here's what we'll do. Here's our file, right? And the first thing to do is specify the version of essentially the API that we're using, the Docker Compose API that we're using. We're using this one, which is 3.7. I don't know. Okay. And then here, with Docker Compose, you can kind of use multiple kind of images at once. So we're specifying each image you can think of as a service. So we're specifying, okay, here's our services. And then we'll list the first one to be web. Okay, so we're listing kind of what is the first service we're using. So you could think web would be one, like our database. Remember we worked with the Postgres image? That would be like a separate service, right? Here we have our website, and then maybe that would connect eventually to a separate image somehow. Then we can just specify what the image is. So it's Flask Docker, right? And that's just coming from, right, the name of the image that we want to use is Flask Docker. And then we can specify some other things. So for instance, we can do the ports. Now, I'll explain this in a second. So do this hyphen for whatever reason. I'll explain that. And we're going to map port 5000 to port 5000. So what are we doing so far? We're basically taking this line that we used to kind of have to specify in our in our terminal, and we're translating it to into code essentially, right? It's called like configuration as code. So here we're specifying the image, right? That's coming from here. Here we're specifying the port 5000 to 5000, just like we did previously. We can also do the environment. So this would be Flask app equals project init.py. I think it's just like that. Actually, we need to do this dash. All right, so let me explain what these dashes are about. This hyphen is representing a Python list. It says, hey, each element here is actually a list. So for example, in our image currently, we only need to map port 5000 to port 5000, right? We only have to allow access to a website. But let's say like we also had our database somehow running in this image. We would do another one, 5432 to 5432 or whatever it is. Okay, so what the hyphen is doing is essentially creating a list or specifying the first. It's kind of doing two things. It's specifying this is an element of the list, and therefore there is a list that we are using. So we have our ports, and we are saying this is the first and only element in this list. Same thing with environmental variables, right? You can have more than one environmental variable. So we could do like foo equals bar, and now we have two environmental variables, and we're saying this is the first element. This is the first environmental variable. This is the second one. Okay. Docker Compose, you can look at the documentation. It tells you that essentially this has to be even if there's only one environmental variable, we need to make this a list. Okay, so that's how we're doing that with the hyphen. All right, let's see this thing. So now you can see we have this Docker Compose. Let's just make sure we can access this from multiple spots. Okay, and the way we can boot this up is with Docker Compose up. All right, so look, this is running, right, our Flask app, port 5000. And if we go to port 5000, we can see automatically, right, we have access to it. Why? Because we're specifying this here. Okay. So we can also go to /users. Okay. So the way that we're booting up, so we're like specifying all these arguments, these command line arguments as code here. And then we're in the directory that our Docker Compose file exists. We're running Docker Compose up. If we navigate, you have to be in that same directory as the Docker Compose file, like directory. So for instance, if I'm outside of it and I'm like, hey, what's running right now? I can do Docker Compose PS. But you see it says, hey, there is no configuration file that we have. So let's go to the, what is it called? Docker Notes. And now I'll do Docker Compose PS, and you see that this is listing the containers running in this like Docker Compose service, like ecosystem. Okay, this is the name of the container. It's giving me one automatic.